Hello and welcome to this session. Uh, I'm Dr. Peter Shephard, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some ideas and thoughts on learning and mastering our memory. Now, you may have perhaps come across this famous quotation by Confucius, where he says, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, and I do and I understand. But what we also might add to this is the more I do, the more I repeat, then the better I understand. And so repetition, of course, is a key to learning and, of course, fixing things into our memory. Now, what I wanted to share with you is that when we talk about learning and memory, we're really talking about the brain. And you'll see that there's this concept of what I might like to call whole brain thinking and learning, and therefore, of course, whole brain memory. And we'll go into this a little later. But this is showing the idea that we have what's called a split brain. It's in two halves, if you like. And I have actually a brain with me. Sometimes I joke and say it's very useful to carry a spare brain. And I'm going to split this in half as well. And so then you'll be able to see that more or less the picture you've got there is what I am showing you here, except there's a piece missing. And that's a little piece like this, which you might almost think of rather like a drumstick. And this is the emotional brain. It's called the limbic system. We'll go into this shortly. But absolutely critical for good memory. Okay, so let's look at this idea of our whole brain again. This is a famous picture that's been around many years, and you can see that you've got certain items on the left and certain items on the right, which are showing the preferences that we may have at any one moment of time. And in fact, if you look at this particular picture, you could probably make a decision where you would prefer to be. Most people would say they much prefer to be over on the right, where they're having some fun and they're playing around. Now, another way of looking at this is that all learning actually takes place in the brain. It doesn't take place in the classroom or so there's another concept that says all learning occurs in our brain. It doesn't actually occur in a classroom or in the computer or on our laptop. It is in the brain. No brain, brain dead. Doesn't matter what technology we have, we're no longer learning. And so it's good to know a little bit about the brain. And as I was showing it earlier, we've got this sort of outer cerebral layer, the cerebral cortex, which actually occupies almost 80% of our brain. And then there is this little fellow that I call the drumstick inside, only about 10% of our brain, but think of it as turbocharged. Sometimes this is called the limbic system, sometimes it's called the midbrain. Very essential for memory. And then, of course, there is a third part which leads on into our spinal cord called the reptilian brain. We'll actually look at another way of viewing this. And so you've got that outer cortex, some 80% of our brain. We often call this our cognitive or thinking brain. And then there's the limbic. And then there's the reptilian, which is an extension of our spinal cord. And if we take this particular concept or model called the triune brain, of course, tri meaning three and une one, three and one, then it looks at the various categories or functions under these three brains. So the the reptilian, sometimes called the hindbrain, very much at the instinctive level of behavior. Then the emotional, the mammalian, where feelings come in. And then we got the outer cerebral cortex, the thinking, conceptualizing, and maybe a lot of what you're using at this moment of time. Now, also what's important in terms of the brain is the thought that you treat it like a chemical soup pot, that all the time we are thinking, learning, moving, chemicals, neurotransmitters are moving between all the various cells in the brain. And there are some quite critical hormones that come into our learning. I'm not going to go into the brain physiology too much. We've probably heard of the adrenaline rush when we're all very excited, hyped up. And then there are the two sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone. These do have an influence on male and female learning, which we'll discover later. But two important ones called dopamine and serotonin. And these factor in very much. Let's look at the dopamine, which is a hormone that is comes about when we, more excited, when we're watching our favorite football match and our team scores, and we jump up and we cheer and we shout and we clap, or when we give someone a high five. This is the dopamine. And then after an event, maybe when we want to relax, we want to calm down, then serotonin is being pumped into our brain. Now, the important thing is that we have these two in balance. And so while we're looking at the emotional brain being critical to learning and memory, we want to have positive emotional connections, and the positive ones will actually strengthen those memories. And of course, the hormones coming in help strengthen or weaken those as we go along. Now, I want to run through a few very important principles of learning and memory. And the first one, interestingly, is all about sleep. So we're saying, if you really want to learn well, you have to have enough sleep. Sleep is absolutely critical to the formation and the storage of memory. Of course, if we also get a good night's sleep, we're better able to focus, pay attention during the day, during our sessions, and also sleep happens to have play an important role in our immune system. Now, when we sleep, we typically go through a number of patterns where our brain is, when we're like right at this minute, alert in the beta mode, very active, and then we go into the alpha. If the serotonin comes in, we relax, we deep breathe, we listen to some pleasant music, and we can drift off to sleep. And then we go into the theta brain waves. And it's during this period that we have our sleep, dreams, dream sleep, perhaps it's called, REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And this is where actually the learning occurs. And then, of course, afterwards, we go into a deeper sleep, but we go through these in the sort of cycles throughout the night. And so we have our alpha, and then we go down into the theta, later into delta, and then we come back out again. And this cycle typically lasts about 90 minutes. And so if we only have 6 hours sleep in a given night, then we've got a lesser number of cycles we're going to go through, perhaps around 4. But if we have 8 hours sleep, then we're going to get much, much more. So the more cycles we go through, the better will be the building of our memories. Now, the next principle, very important, would be exercise. Because after all, uh, the brain needs a lot of glucose, it needs nutrients, and these come from our blood supply. And so movement, exercise promotes breathing and good blood supply to our brain. Now, typically, of course, when we're learning, we have to pay attention. We have to be able to focus. And I hope that while you're listening to me, you're more like this student who's putting a hand up and is obviously alert and awake. And I hope that my voice has not been putting you to sleep. So our brain tends not to like to attend the boring things. And so we've got to keep things very active and moving so that we are alert. And then, of course, the dopamine is coming in. So while I'm talking or listening or interacting, I'm getting more of that dopamine in my brain. Now, how to sustain concentration, especially if I'm studying at home, it's very important, of course, that we have a purpose. Are we clear about what we are wanting to learn or trying to learn at any one moment of time? Do we have some passion for the subject? Because this really fuels our motivation to learn. There are other factors in the environment. I don't have time to go into much, but how we are seated, the temperature of the room or the learning environment, even lighting, and sometimes we might prefer silence, or sometimes we might prefer some music. And maybe it's not good to sit too long, and so we have to be able to stand up and move around. And all of these things will help our concentration. Now, there is a lot of theories about music. The Mozart effect, it's sometimes been called, and the idea of the right type of music is listed here. And it's music that's played at about 60 beats per minute, which roughly equates with our resting heart rate. Now, you can study the slide a little later. You will all be getting copies of the slides, but some very recent research has been done on music and learning, something called targeted memory reactivation. And simply what it means is that they did a trial and they had a test group and a control group. And the people who had some music being played in the background during, say, a lecture or a talk, but it could also be actually if you were even reading, that same music is played later, about 30 minutes after you fall asleep. And the study revealed that the students who listened to the music while they were studying and had it played later during their sleep actually did much, much better on various results. Now, I don't have time to go into that detail, but it's a very interesting piece of research on music. Now, then, of course, it's important, as we've already mentioned, that we need to repeat. And here, a little saying that I think is easy to remember: repeat to remember, but remember to repeat. So repetition is key to strengthening our memories. Now, another factor is learning styles, and we all as individuals, some of us being more left-brained, and so if I'm showing the left hemisphere of the brain, that's my preference for using the left versus maybe using the right. But there's also whether we are more a visual learner, or whether we learn better by listening, by being auditory, or actually hands-on and doing and getting emotionally and physically connected with the learning. This is where we say we see, we hear, and we do. And then more recently, the concept of the digital learner, that we're now finding, particularly younger generation people, don't seem to be able to spend very much time without some digital advice. So that device has, with technology, come very much into our learning environment. Now, another principle is that we should try to use as many of the senses as we can. And vision happens to be the strongest. We tend to recall about 65% of what we've been learning some 72 hours later, versus if we're only listening, verbal only, contrasted 16%. So very big difference. And if we can also do things at the same time, then we're using more senses. We're able to accelerate our learning, if you will. And so now we do have an activity, and I might just show this to you. I don't think we're physically going to have much time to do it, but if you'd like to go back later in your own good time and do this activity, it probably will take a couple of minutes. And so we're going to show a list A. Then you would write down from memory everything that you can in about 45 to 60 seconds. And then we will contrastingly show some images. Again, you would also do that. Study them for 45 to 60 seconds, and then capture what you can recall. And so if I'm showing list A, we won't do this now because you'll need to pick up a pencil and paper and start writing them down. But here are 20 items, words. Then we go to the second part of the activity, and we look at 20 pictures. And again, we study those for, up to about a minute or so. And then we would ask ourselves, how did we do? Now, most people will have recalled vastly more items from the pictures, from the images, than from the word list. And so this is just a little memory test, if you like, that you can do. There's another one, and I'd like you to do this again on your own, in your own good time. Sit down quietly where you can relax, have some pencil and paper, and over a minute or two, try to recall as many things as you can remember having heard or read or seen, items from the news, from TV, newspaper, etc., radio. And you list those down. Then you take another list and you try to recall as many of the types of food or drink that you consumed in the, say, last 24 hours. So we're recalling two sets of information, one on news items in the last 24 hours, and the other all the food and drink that you've eaten. Now, typically, people can recall a lot of the food and the types of food, because what they're now doing is they're using more of their senses. And so what we will see that these senses of sight and taste and smell are all there, reinforcing the learning. And we're actually doing more of the use of whole brain learning. We're using more of our whole brain when we use many, many senses. Now, another principle, I won't have time to dwell much on this, but there's a famous quotation that you may have heard of where we say, we are what we eat. But I'd rather change that to, we become what we have eaten, but maybe over the last 20 or 30 years, not just the last 20 or 30 hours. And so nutrition is absolutely critical to an active, alert, fully functioning brain, and of course, memory. There are a number of recipes of things you should and shouldn't eat. Here are a few of those that you've probably come across. And if you're generally getting most of these in a 24-hour cycle, uh, and minimally some of these 3 or 4 times a week, then you're going to be enhancing your brain health and therefore, of course, your ability to think, focus, concentrate, and recall. Now, I did mention gender in the beginning when we were looking at the left and the right brain and other factors. So again, we can see that females tend to use the left and the right brain interactively a little more. They have a, a superior verbal capacity. There is this piece of the brain that we call the corpus callosum that we referred to earlier. And this is actually larger, more dense. It has a greater number of nerve fibers connecting the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And so there are differences, and it's important to appreciate those. Now, another important principle, this is principle number 9, is stress kills learning. And so it's important that we manage our stress, that we're not too stressed when we are trying to learn. So that becomes very, very important because stress produces certain other hormones, such as cortisol, and these can actually kill our memory. They can disrupt us from being able to concentrate fully. Some de-stressors that we may have come across, they can be included in what we're eating and drinking. Other aspects of physical, even sex, massage, progressive body relaxation, soft music, yoga, aerobic exercise. Many, many factors come in here, along with our nutrition and our diet and our sleep. So we can see that when we put all these things together, the 9 principles, then what is interesting is if you look at this particular couple of PET scans, the one on the left is showing much more activity. You look at the red colors in the brain here, and these are parts of the brain that are very active when we're concentrating, learning, listening, such as you are doing now. But when it comes to mastery, when you're doing something you've already learned, you've mastered it, you'll find there's a lot less effort being played up in the brain. In other words, mastery takes less energy and it's easier. So if you know a subject very well, it's very easy for you to talk about it for 1 hour. But if it's new to you and you're learning it, it takes a lot more energy and effort, and you actually can feel much more tired at the end of a learning session. So it may well be that you will be vastly more tired listening to me than me speaking to you. And so, rounding up or coming to the end, these are 3 little scans that were done through an activity by Harvard Medical School that showed that when you were learning certain things, the first slide is showing our primary motor cortex, and then there's the right hippocampus, part of our limbic system, the emotional brain, integrated, and then even part of our prefrontal thinking cortex. Now, these 3 are integrated when we're actually learning what we might call keyboard skills, or learning to play the piano, because we're playing on a keyboard. And so the physical, the emotional, the memory are all coming into play in different parts of the brain And the important thing is then for whole brain learning is that we're trying to integrate as many as possible. And so for my last slide, I would just say that it's also very useful when we go back to talking about whether we're more left-brained or right-brained or what our learning style preferences are. That personality comes in very much, and we need to know the different personality traits of our students. For example, if we're a teacher or a lecturer, or if we're just learning on our own, we also need to know our strong personality traits, because some people have a longer attention span, some have a shorter one. This we might call nature, the innate, genetically influenced traits that make up our strong personality differences. But then there's nurture. And here, of course, we're saying we need both. It's not nature via nurture, or versus nurture, sorry, but it's nature via nurture. Nature requires nurture. And this is where culture comes in very, very much. And so cultural influences can equally play a very, very strong role in our learning. And so I hope that you enjoyed the session, that you learned something from it. I thank you for sharing with me, sitting there in the audience, which I am unable not to be able to join you and to see, but hopefully it was beneficial. And I would like to thank very much Eurasia Forum for inviting me to uh, share my thoughts on learning and memory. Best of luck.